Now, one of the things that we've already said is we need to change society, don't we? And if we're going to effect a revolution, we need to change society. How are we going to do that? Well, the best way is war. You use war to change society. Why? Because in the name of the war effort, you'll stand still for almost anything. You'll have increased taxes, increased regulations, the curtailment of your travel, any number of different things in the name of winning the war. One example is the cigarette tax. In the name of World War II, they put a tax on cigarettes that didn't exist there before by the federal government. Now, when the war was over, did they get rid of that tax? Of course they didn't. But there were a lot of other things as well that they didn't get rid of in the name of winning the war, which were regulatory. They confiscated businesses, all sorts of things like that. But the war has to be on your soil to really make those changes. Can't be a war over there. It's got to be a war here. Terror is another way of affecting change. In the name of terror, in the name of security, in the name of protecting your neighborhood and your home from terrorists that may or may not be there, but you're convinced they are, then you will stand still for limitations on your freedom. We see that, for instance, don't we, with the war on terror today, with the government's ability to violate the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, of searching your private records and everything else in violation without a war warrant. Economic collapse will do it too. And mass immigration will do it. So the best one, though, is war. So how do we bring about a war in the United States? How do we do that? We're not going to get England or France or Spain to invade us. We already had that. The last one was the War of 1812. And the English and everybody knew that they couldn't invade the United States. It's just impossible. So they developed a plan to bring about a war inside the United States. We recognize that war today as the Civil War. And you can put any label you want on it, an economic war, a war against slavery, all that. All of these things were used as excuses. Most of the people that brought about the war, you can document the fact they hated the Constitution of the United States. They hated the freedom of the American people. The leaders of the anti-slavery abolitionist movement hated the Constitution. They just didn't want to amend the Constitution to get rid of slavery. They wanted to destroy the Constitution, whether it was Phillips, whether it was Garrison, or who the leaders were. And they said so publicly. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the reasons why the people that lived at that time were not enthusiastic about eliminating slavery right away, because they didn't like what came with it. It wasn't that they were for slavery. They just didn't want to hand leadership over to these people that wanted to get rid of the Constitution in the process. So it was very slow, and there was a lot of resistance to this. But the thing that really finally turned this thing around was the terrorism that they produced on American soil to get the war started. They used terror to actually start the war. And the individuals that I have listed here are individuals who finance socialist and terrorist cause, these industrialists. We have the idea that industrialists, capitalists, are anti-communists. That's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of them that helped the communists over the years because they themselves believed in it. Whether it was Robert Owen, a Scotch industrialist who started communist communes in the United States. Frederick Engels was an industrialist, a partner of Marx. Garrett Smith, who was part of the Astor Empire, John Jacob Astor. Andrew Carnegie had to leave England because of his involvement in the British Chartist movement. Chartist. And that's just another name for communist. The Chartist newspaper, The Republican, published the Communist Manifesto, the first ones that published the Communist Manifesto in England. Andrew Carnegie was a man who was part of this Chartist movement. Cornelius Vanderbilt financed that Wall Street Journal that I just talked about, it wasn't called the Wall Street Journal, but that's what it was in fact. And because he was sleeping with Woodhull's sister. She was his mistress. And so he helped finance these sisters in their communist activities. Now, the chief instrument of communist terror, which reacted the South into secession, was John Brown. John Brown was a communist according to his son, okay? Now, you won't read that in your history books. But what happened with John Brown was he created such a reaction in the South because of Harper's Ferry that the Southerners were scared to death. In 1850, they had a secessionist convention in the South, and they didn't secede because they weren't ready to secede. But after John Brown, they were, because it showed them, amongst other things, that the Northerners, in their eyes, were ready to kill them all. I mean, literally. And so John Brown was used to create that condition. And the terrorist John Brown was helped by individuals who can trace their organizations directly to the Illuminati through the First International, like Sumner and Phillips and Greeley. Alan Pinkerton, remember him? He's the guy that helped start the Secret Service in the United States. He was the guy that formed the Pinkerton Detective Agency, using the all-seeing eye as his emblem. In fact, the all-seeing eye of his emblem led to the slogan, Private Eye. That's where that came from, was Pinkerton's illuminist eye. The Carbonari under Hugh Phillips, Skull and Bones, for those of you who've studied that. The man who started Skull and Bones was William Russell. And William Russell was named a trustee of John Brown's will. Now, you won't find that in the modern histories of John Brown. You got to go back about 30 or 40 years to start picking up on the fact in these histories of John Brown that William Russell helped finance John Brown and was one of the trustees of his will. Because the thing is, too many people have studied Skull and Bones today, and so if they saw this name connected to John Brown, a lot of eyebrows would go up and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And the Secret Six is usually the group of people that they claim were the ones behind John Brown. They were only part of it, believe me. And the Brotherhood of the Union, which was led by the Rosicrucian leader, George Lepard. The Brotherhood of the Union was one of the most influential organizations in the United States you've never heard of. I had never heard of it until I stumbled across it and I says, what is this? And then realized it was to be an umbrella group for all of these leftists. They're going to form an umbrella group to unite towards doing certain things. Now, the interesting thing on this chart is these are the individuals and organizations that helped John Brown. Some of these people had to flee the United States after Harper's Ferry because they knew they could be tried for treason. None of them were. They only tried, and those individuals found at Harper's Ferry, they let everybody else go. And some very big people were involved in the United States government doing all of this. Newspapers. These newspapers, and this is just a few, actually had reporters writing with John Brown, participating in the murder and mayhem and arson, and writing back as unbiased observers to the newspapers about this great saint called John Brown who's trying to free the slaves. And today we see things that are similar, don't we? For instance, we see video on TV where they'll go into a FARC training camp of terrorists in Colombia and show them, in their camps getting trained and all the rest of it. But the Colombian government, for some reason or another, can't seem to find them. But this reporter can, and come in and video them and then leave with the video. Whose side do you think that guy's on? He's not an unbiased observer, you see. He's kind of like the Mark Krasnowskis of the world and that sort of thing that I mentioned earlier. They have a bias, but it doesn't show up in print all the time. And so these sorts of newspapers help propel this idea of this terrorist and what he was doing. And Southerners were reading these newspapers. They were saying, uh-oh, this has gone too far. They literally want to kill us. That's what they're saying in some of this stuff. And the people behind John Brown are getting away with this. It's time for us to leave. And that's what caused them to secede. That's what finally made the mass population of the South to leave. Now, I don't want to leave the South alone without saying this one point. I concentrated on my book about the northern aspect of the conspiracy because the North won the Civil War, right? So it had the major influence on the rest of the country. But we had these types of conspirators in the South. You'll see in my book very prominent individuals in the North and the South who called for the separation of the country into two parts. And as soon as it was separated, the agitators in the North became super patriots. We can't allow these people to leave. We've got to fight a war to keep them, keep the Union together and all that. And sometimes the speeches were made within 30 days of each other. It's incredible. In the South, it was a little bit different. They called for the separation, the secession, but as soon as the secession happened, they became obstructionists, preventing the South from winning the war within the Confederate government, within the state governments. For instance, Brown, who was the governor of Georgia when Sherman marched to the sea and on the way he burned Atlanta. Did you know he had 10,000 troops under his command and he dismissed them, told them to lay down their arms and go home before Sherman even marched into Georgia? After the war, Brown became one of the richest men in the South because he became an in-place carpetbagger. I mean, he started to take advantage of Reconstruction and buying up property, you know, cents on the dollar and everything else. The man was really bad. All that's in the book. And I've already mentioned this, we concentrate more on the conspiracy in the North simply because the North had more influence after the war going forward. Now, one of the things that happened in the war was a lot of the European communists came to the United States and became generals in the Union Army. For instance, Karl Wedemeyer was a personal friend of Karl Marx. Marx actually lived in his house for a time. He helped him form the First Internationale. Same with August Willich, Karl Schurz, Friedrich Anneke, Gustav Paul Clausewitz. In fact, Clausewitz, 5 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, was what they called the Red General in Paris. When the communists took over Paris and started to slaughter the clergy, you know, the Archbishop of Paris and others to form a communist government in Paris. And he was fresh from the Civil War. That's the kind of thing that was going on. There were 40 German radicals. I'm using the term radical rather than communist because some of them I can't absolutely prove were communists, became generals in the Union Army. 78 others besides them were made generals in the Union Army. And in the Confederate Army, they only had 10 foreign-born. That's it. Whereas they had, 130 practically in the North. And it was a real serious problem. And many of those men went on to become very important. Karl Schurz, for instance, we're in the state of Wisconsin right now. And in this state, he's a very famous individual because he came straight from communist revolutions in Europe into Wisconsin and was made a colonel in the militia and a trustee of the University of Wisconsin almost immediately, and became very important in the United States. Look him up. You can see how to spell his name. They won't tell you he was a communist, but just when you read it and see what he was involved in, it will be amazing to you. And then start to research this guy. Go back in his life and really spend some time. You will see he was always under communist orders, from the time he was a student at the university, and his main professor was a leader in the communist movement. But at any rate, we document in the book the fact that many of these communists went into foreign service, into the State Department. It was really quite a problem. And we're running out of time now, and I can't really get into some of the things that these men did in foreign service. So let me just end up on this one little note, just to give you one other example of an individual. One of the people that was appointed by President Pierce as our consul in Rome was George Sanders. George Sanders and the future President of the United States, James Buchanan, hosted a dinner for all these communist revolutionaries in London, whereat they advocated overthrowing the governments of Europe and killing all the rulers. And they ended up the banquet by singing the Marseillaise. And it was so bad that when the Senate got wind of it, they would not confirm George Sanders as our consul in London. When he came home, he gave a speech in New York, wherein he said that we need to have a revolution and reinstitute the guillotine. Only this time we need it driven by steam. Ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. And that was the kind of guys that we were sending overseas. And I'd like to get into the Ostend Manifesto and other things to show these revolutionary involvement in these things. You find it all in my book. But again, I want to thank you for coming here tonight. I wish I could have expanded on each one of these points to an end in itself, but we just didn't have the time. I hope I've pricked your curiosity so that you will read the book and you will go online and say, I just don't believe this. I just can't believe what I'm reading here. I'm going to research it for myself. Because one of the things that I wanted to do in my book was to stimulate others from their vantage point to do their own research and hopefully write more books in this early American history that we never learned in school. And I hope one day we will understand that a conspiracy does exist to tear down the United States. They've been working at it for over 230 years. They haven't been successful because of the layers of strength and morality within the American people and the fact that they fight each other. If they stop fighting each other, I hope that never happens, because united they are very strong and it would be difficult to stop them. But we have to stand up. We have to be vigilant. We have to understand the Constitution and the principles on which it's founded. And we always have to keep in mind, we have to remain a moral people. Thank you very much.